Good morning, it's Friday, November 14th. Meteorologist Andrew Pritchard taking a look at your Canadian Prairie weather story. We're going to be talking about scattered flurries and light showers. That's just about it as far as precipitation goes over the next 7 to 10 days. We've got a pattern change beginning across North America, but it does stay dry across the prairies at least until the very end of the month. Temperatures also stay on the mild side for mid-November standards. Maybe have some cold coming, though, as we get toward, again, the last few days of November, heading on into the beginning of December. The last 10 days, scattered amounts here, above about half an inch. Other areas that were pretty dry here. Again, continue to see a pretty dry pattern across the central part of North America. We've seen heavy precipitation in coastal areas of British Columbia, high elevations there, all the way down the Pacific Northwest into Northern California. We've also seen several big lows running up the northeast coast into maritime Canada. But in between here, a lot of dry real estate. We can take a look at the satellite picture here. We've got a very amplified jet stream right now, a big ridge. Again, in the middle part of the continent here, this is what's delivered a lot of the mild and dry air here from the Canadian prairies all the way down into the Corn Belt of the U.S. Now, we've got a bit more flow up here across the prairie today. This has helped kicking off some of those scattered showers, some of those flurries in the area. You see a little bit of a swirl here from an area of low pressure across northern portions of Alberta and British Columbia. The main part of the jet stream, though, here is kind of coming around the base of this trough. So we're going to see a deeper trough develop across the western part of the U.S., really, as we head into the middle and late part of next week. And that's going to help amplify a storm track down here across the central and southern U.S., but it's going to kind of take the jet stream momentum away from this area that it's been hanging out here. So while we never really tapped into it here across the prairies, we're going to see the pattern overhead objectively quiet down. It's not going to make a big difference here because it hasn't been all that rainy or snowy across the prairies, and that's really what the outlook is over the next 7 days. Not all that rainy or snowy, though there promises to be some change way out there in the maybe week 2 to week 3 time frame as we go into the beginning of December. Still looking at a potentially cold and snowy winter season across the prairies. Taking a look again at the radar here, not much going on. We've got some light flurries in the Calgary area, light rain or snow showers as you make your way down into southern portions of Alberta, maybe a couple raindrops in the Regina area, not very significant precipitation over there in that area as well. Again, just a bit of a system moving through the area. So we've got a temperature contrast, quite mild across southern portions of Saskatchewan, where we're above 10 degrees here on Friday morning. You head up toward Alberta, I was going to say Calgary and Edmonton. That's where you're talking about temperatures a couple degrees below freezing, or below zero. So again, big contrast here. Temperatures in the minus single digits all the way down to 12 to 13 degrees as you make your way across a 500-mile span there from central Alberta down to southern portions of Saskatchewan. Now we'll take a look at the precipitation forecast through the weekend. And again, we're talking about very light flurries, some scattered showers, maybe a light wintry mix across northern Alberta and northern Saskatchewan as we head into the early part of next week. I'll time this all out for you. Again, here's your Friday. Just very light precipitation here in southern Alberta, maybe some of this moving into southern portions of Saskatchewan as we head through the day as well. But this gets out of here and really tapers off during the overnight into the day on Saturday. So pretty quiet across the prairies on Saturday, to be quiet across the prairies on Sunday as well. Next little piece of energy here brings some light precipitation as we move into the day on Monday, November 17th. Total precipitation by type, though, today, Friday through Monday, November 17th, we're talking about, again, some very light snowfall across southern Alberta and southwestern Saskatchewan. Very, very light precipitation amounts from this activity as we head through the weekend. This is what's kicking it all off. We've got a jet stream pattern, something like this. It's pretty amplified and pretty busy across North America right now. So we've got this disturbance, this upper level low that is moving through the northern portions of the Prairie provinces. Again, it's got that temperature contrast here, bringing in some cooler air, kicking off some very light flurries. And then here's the bigger trough dropping down here off the coast of California with that big ridge right through the central part of North America. Now we'll go ahead and animate this and I'll show you the change that we go through over the next several days. Again, we keep ridging in place across the prairies. That's what's going to be keeping us quiet as we go through the weekend. And then you see this big upper level low developing across the southwestern U.S. with ridging still in place across the Canadian prairies. So now you see the lines on the map here are pretty spaced out, and that means we've got very weak jet stream flow. The stronger flow, the lines tightly packed together, are rounding the base of this trough and now lifting into the southern and central plains of the U.S., eventually moving into the Midwest and the Great Lakes there. This is going to bring some badly needed moisture to this region here, but it kind of then takes the energy here across North America and drops it south of the prairie. So now you're south of the active storm track, which again, in some cases might mean a really cold pattern for you, but we've not yet established a big cold pool up here, and it's going to take developing a big trough up here like the models are trying to do kind of way out here. We're getting into November 21st, 22nd, and 23rd to kind of bring some of this flow up into the Arctic here, up over the top of a big Alaskan ridge here, and then seeing a big area of low pressure developing now all the way out to November 24th, 25th, and 26th. This would tug some colder air down into the prairie, and we're probably looking at an evolution, something like this, that takes us maybe 10 to 14 days to get to, helping us bring in some cooler air down into the prairie. Now, this is where we can look at the jet stream winds kind of verbatim instead of looking at height anomalies. Now we're looking at the actual jet stream winds. So you see the fast flow overhead now. Again, here's Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. That fast flow rounding the base of that little swirl I showed you on the satellite map. You saw the temperature contrast and the very light precipitation going on thanks to this. It gets out of here, though, over the next couple of days, and as I kind of walk it back to Saturday and Sunday, here's where you see ridging. You see the jet stream making this little hump here over the prairie and very weak flow. That's a quiet day. That's a quiet weekend for us in the prairie. And as I walk it into the early part of next week, now we're getting into Monday, into Tuesday. Look at this complete void in jet stream flow. We've taken the momentum now and shoved it way south around the base of this trough across the southwestern U.S., fast jet stream flow. Southwest flow lifting from the southern plains into the Great Lakes. That is the recipe for an active storm track, one that we have not seen since the early spring across North America, but it is well south of you here in the prairie. The jet stream is going to be quiet overhead all the way into, again, the end of next week, Friday, November 21st. This is where we start to see that next chance for a big disruptive storm here, maybe tugging some colder air in and perhaps bringing some impactful precipitation into the prairie. We'll have to watch this, though, because a lot of signs this just kind of rounds the base of that trough as well, kind of reinforcing this pattern down here. So while I think that probably the end of November, getting into next week, we're probably talking about finally shifting to a colder pattern, but when do we get a big storm system to actually bring some high impact precipitation, some big winds into the prairies? That's something we got to kind of just keep watching for at this point. Temperatures, again, going to stay on the mild side through the next 7 days. We do have that potential to tug some colder air in here at the end of the loop around November 25th into the last few days of November. And then I'll show you a look here at the precipitation forecast, kind of verbatim from the European model running out over the next 2 weeks. This is a little disturbance here, bringing that light precipitation here for your Friday. We know that we quiet out on Saturday and Sunday with high pressure in place across the region. Keeping it pretty quiet here Monday into Tuesday. Again, weak jet stream flow ridging overhead, not going to be a recipe for high impact precipitation across the prairies. So you're seeing here, as I kind of walk it back and forth early next week around Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, the chance for some flurries, some very light showers, but nothing in the way of organized precipitation moving through. And that's the case all the way out to the end of next week. Now we're getting into the November, the end of November here, looking at very disorganized precipitation overhead. So if we take a look at the next 2 weeks from the European ensemble here, again, the pattern is objectively active across North America, but we're going to kind of rob the prairies of the momentum here and drop it down here to the southern and central U.S., where you see that big blob of heavy precipitation. Meanwhile, across the prairie provinces, that green and blue shading is indicative of anywhere from 10 to maybe 15 millimeters of precipitation over the next 15 days. You can look at this in another way with the European ensembles here. This is the probability of picking up a half an inch or less of total precipitation. So who's dry is where you want to look for the orange and the red shading here over the next 2 weeks. And of course, a big swath of that, probably the biggest swath of that across the prairies here and across the southeast U.S. and then up through the Rockies. So the prairies, we stay dry here over the next 2 weeks. Potential that we could, get more active as we get into the beginning part of December. I'll show you that here in a moment. One last look at the precipitation forecast here. This is the European operational model. So this is just kind of the ensemble we run many times. This is the run it once and just see what happens. You can kind of pick out some fluky things that may or may not happen, but the idea remains the same across the prairie. We're just not the active area. It's going to be California, the West Coast, and then up through the central and southern parts of the United States, the Midwest, southern U.S., areas that badly need the moisture, but areas that are not, the Canadian prairies. So you look at total, total accumulated wind gusts here over the next 2 weeks, and we're still, without a big area of low pressure moving through the area, we're not talking about real gusty winds. So breezy at times, certainly across the prairies, but really the highest wind gusts, even over the next 2 weeks, we're talking about 40 to 50 kilometers per hour. So I'm sure the pattern is going to come and get us here at some point across the prairies as we move through this winter. It really does look like that is going to be the case as we look at the newest data here for December, January, and February, and both the European seasonal forecast on the left and the NMME on the right here, going after a above average, storm track, above average precipitation across the prairies into the northern plains of the U.S. here. This would be a pretty classic La Nina pattern. We'll just have to kind of watch how sea surface temperatures evolve, how this La Nina evolves here. It's expected to peak early in the winter and then fade over the back half of the weekend. We'll be watching the MJO, the Madden-Julian oscillation as well. So if you're not watching Eric and Matt and their, longer discussions here in the early morning hours, covering the overall pattern evolution, definitely, dip your toe in that, a couple times a week if you want to kind of, stay more in tune with how this pattern is evolving here, because, they'll keep an eye on some of these bigger patterns. But my message remains the same here. Pretty quiet across the prairie, even though it's active around us here across North America. But I do think the activity is coming probably in 2 to 3 weeks' time here. I think we'll be talking about some bigger storm systems, some higher impact storm systems, and some bigger cold air across the prairies. Temperatures over the next 10 days in some of our select cities here. Calgary, high of 8 tomorrow, 6 on Sunday, 5 on Monday. You see it flirting with some colder temperatures at the end of the forecast run here in each of these cities here. Edmonton, again, high temperatures above 0 until we get to potentially the last week of November. Saskatoon, here's Regina, and then we'll finish here in Winnipeg. Again, much more mild today, 11 for the high today. That cold front sweeps through. It's still quiet over the weekend, just a bit cooler. A high of 2 tomorrow, 1 on Sunday. Temperatures really hovering around freezing during the afternoons over the next week, potentially trending colder as we get into the last week of November.